Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to be talking about what makes a player good in WoW Classic, and in particular, I guess, what makes a healer good in WoW Classic. And I think we're going to generalize this to maybe just what makes a good player overall in games, right, or any sort of competition. Because there's a couple things I want to talk about based on, this is going to be an interesting video because there's going to be some real sports examples kind of thrown in here, as well as some other esports examples, and just kind of like my observations about what makes somebody a good player, what the most important factor is. So you hear a lot of people talk, in video games especially, about mechanics, right? Now, Classic WoW is not really a game that you would think of as having a lot of like mechanical skill expression necessarily, but there's been games over the years like StarCraft, League of Legends in some aspects. Obviously, League of Legends is a little bit different because the game is not as intense all the time, right? It kind of comes in bursts, but there's still a mechanical element there. And then games like Fortnite, right? All these games are they're considered to be very intensive mechanically, and rightfully so, I mean, for the most part, right? And if you ask somebody, like, what's a really surefire way that somebody's going to be good at League or good at Fortnite or good at a game in general, I feel like they'll typically say mechanics, and I think people like to lean into this, too, because it's something that can be trained to some degree, right? You can kind of go into creative in Fortnite, or you can go into like custom map on StarCraft and just practice your build order or practice your edits on Fortnite. You can practice your CSing on League. There's lots of ways that you can, in FPS, you can aim train, right? So I think people generally like the idea that mechanics are the most important thing because they're kind of the easiest thing to train on. And this is something I feel like that when I kind of like started getting more into like competitive activities and competitive games in particular, that was the area of focus that I tried to be good at, right? Like I wanted to be as mechanically sound as possible, I think that's like a good intuition to have about things, right? Because why not do the thing that you can repeat practice and over and over again, right? That you can get good at. So like League of Legends, I didn't really play League much, but when I was trying to like learn the game, one thing I would play AD carry, and I would go into like bot games and just CS, right? So you just CS, and then once you kind of got that down, you would start trying to push while CSing, right? And you try and just basically push your limits as much as possible while still getting as many CS as possible. So yeah, I think that's basically like what people tend to think about is like the most important thing, and it kind of is like similar for sports in some ways. Like I think when people think about what makes a good basketball player, what makes a good football player, like think about like a shooter in basketball or like a quarterback in football, they tend to think of like mechanics, right? Like and also like some talent things. There's a bit of crossover there. Like they have like an insane arm, they have good form, how's their shooting form, how's their release, how's this, how's that. And the point of this video isn't to downplay any of those things. In fact, I think in some instances, in particularly in a game like StarCraft 1, right, mechanics are actually almost one of the most important things, particularly in that game. But I think it's really only in that game that they are kind of like the most important thing. And that's just because in that game, it's such a cumulative game where you're building an advantage over time, right? So that your mechanics scale in that game in a way that they don't necessarily scale in other games. Because from the moment, like second zero that you start the game, if you are just like better mechanically, you're better multitasking, right? You can make more stuff than the opponent, especially in a game like StarCraft 1, keep in mind, because there's not as many automated ways to make things as in StarCraft 2. So it requires a lot more micro, essentially, to efficiently produce in StarCraft 1, which means that every moment you're in the game against somebody worse than you, you're gaining advantage on them in kind of like a massive way. So you can just get to a point in that game where you have too much stuff versus the enemy if you are actually like way better than them. So I think in that particular example, that's like the outlier, because I know everybody likes to bring up outliers whenever you try and talk even a little bit in terms of generalizing things, right? They always bring up that counterexample, which is fine. I get it. But I kind of want to head that one off before we kind of get into the details here a bit more, right? Because I think that is kind of like the real exception here is a game like StarCraft 1. And there may be other games that I heard about this guns game that's like really, really mechanical. I've never played that though, so I don't really know the degree. I've heard that it's like an insanely mechanical game. So maybe in that game as well, mechanics are just like so important. But really, I think that they're kind of overvalued in a lot of games nowadays. And I think especially in newer games, we're going to see that the effectiveness of mechanics, unless like obviously we go in a different direction from where we're heading, but I feel like every new game that comes out, there's kind of some way in the game or some feature or some path you can take to try and like neuter the impact that mechanics have on the actual game itself, right? So they're making it less and less important, I feel like, generally, to have like good mechanics in the game. And they're also being more diligent about removing certain things that mechanics are based off of. So for example, like something like when you think of old school Quake, and I think it's still in the newer Quakes, like Quake Champions and stuff like that, but when you have the, what is it called? Oh my god, it's slipping my mind. The movement system in Quake, strafe jumping, right? So when you have things like that are kind of like, they're sort of unintended, right? Like it's not that they're unintended and that the physics in the game wasn't intended to be developed in the way it was, but they weren't intended to be used that way. Or like in Super Smash Brothers, right? How like the wave dashing works, like again, like all the components are intentional in terms of what the designers intended them to be there for, but the combination, exactly how they're being used, was never intended. So I think we're seeing, as we kind of go like into the future of competitive games, that we're seeing less and less of that. Like companies are trying to root out these types of mechanics that allow like a player to like truly separate themselves from the pack, right? And they're trying to kind of like, maybe homogenize is the wrong word in this case, but they're trying to bring the skill band closer and closer together in terms of like raw mechanical ability at a game, right? And whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'm typically on the side that I lean more towards it being a bad thing, generally speaking. Depending on especially how far you go with it, I could see certain arguments, like maybe you don't want every game to be like StarCraft 1. Right, but I think also that there's probably too big of a squeeze that's happening right now in modern games where they're trying to like really squeeze that skill band close together. But yeah, so the more that they try and do that, the more other things kind of stick out, and you have to really tap into other areas to become a better player, right? And I think that's kind of something that's almost always been the case, but it's going to be even more the case going into the future. And I think decision making really is the thing that separates a lot of the top level players in a lot of in a lot of various different games and even sports, in terms of what makes them the best player they can possibly be. And there's two examples really that kind of come to mind from on either end of the spectrum. And I'll provide some other examples too, but there's two main ones I kind of want to cover in the video to kind of give some ad hoc evidence for my point, right? So the first one is, I don't know if anybody watches college football, but I'm trying to remember when I think it was like 4 years ago, like 2000, 2001, around like the COVID time, something like that. I think I remember Trevor Lawrence wearing a mask, but I'm talking about Trevor Lawrence, and he was basically like kind of like the greatest thing in college football. And it was interesting because there were some really good players in college football at the time. There was Tua Tagovailoa from the University of Alabama, right? Like really, really strong player. And we're mostly talking about quarterbacks here for this particular conversation, but it can obviously be extrapolated to other things as well, right? To other roles and stuff like that. But I'm mostly going to be focusing on the quarterbacks here. So Tua Tunga, sorry, I got two on the brain now. But Trevor Lawrence came along, and he was kind of this phenomenal quarterback talent, right? So he came from high school, did insane in high school, got all sorts of offers, went to Clemson, basically beat out the guy, I believe it was his freshman year, for the job because he was just like way better than the quarterback that they had. And it genuinely seemed like they weren't intending for him to start that year. Like he was going to play behind the quarterback. But the quarterback that they had just wasn't performing up to the level that they needed. And Lawrence just seemed like such an incredible talent that they kind of gave him the reins, and then he just took it over from there, right? I think, if I remember correctly, they won the national championship in their first year, which, they don't really have a term for this. I don't think in college football or football, but if it's kind of like in StarCraft, that would be like a golden road, right? It's like, I believe is what it was called back in the day for StarCraft 1, if you won the one of the Star Leagues in like your first season or something like that. So he was kind of like the golden boy, realistically. Like, there were comparisons being drawn to Peyton Manning, right, and like all sorts of other quarterbacks, and this guy was going to be as a generational talent, and there's basically like nothing that's going to stop this guy. It was like the heir apparent. He was already anointed. He was going to be one of the greats, almost certainly. And usually what happens in college football is, every year they'll have the draft, and the reality is a lot of the players in the draft tend not to pan out. Now, part of that is, I think, a product of the hype, and the hype is not necessarily a negative thing. It's almost something I feel like that needs to happen, in a sense, right? Because the whole idea is that you're trying to find your guy in the draft, especially for quarterbacks, right? And, you only get so many prospects per year, so you have to try and find the right one, and you're just going to, obviously you want to believe that this guy that you're signing that has the potential to really be the guy for your team. Now, a lot of them don't work out, but I guess what I'm saying is it makes no sense to be overtly negative about these players coming in from college, just because the track record on them, just because like a lot of them tend not to work out, doesn't mean that it serves no purpose to be negative, essentially, right? Like you want to be optimistic. You want to try and find the good things in these players, right? And and get my DM buffs here while we have this chat. So yeah, you want to find the good things in these players, and I guess what I'm saying is it's expected for okay, I have to wait a little bit, but it's expected for them not to work out to some degree. But that actually wasn't the case with this Trevor Lawrence guy. That's how good he is. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that there was nobody kind of saying that they thought he'd end up as a bust or he'd probably flop or something like that, because there's usually a lot of talk around the top guys, especially in some of the weaker classes, where it's like, well, this guy's the best of this class, but we're not really sure if he's going to actually develop into an NFL level talent. Everybody was sure about Lawrence. It wasn't even close, and that was just the level of confidence and the level of sentiment that kind of came out. Then he had his first year in the NFL. Didn't really go so well, but there was kind of like a coaching kerfuffle where the head coach was he was a college coach that got brought up. The thought was he would relate well with a lot of the new players, I think, but he ended up having a lot of off-the-field drama, and I think the general consensus was just that he didn't coach the team very well even outside of that. So, the first season that Lawrence had was kind of like, well, we're not going to blame him. Okay, then he had, I believe, a better next season, and then I think it was, I don't know if it was 2023 or 2022, but he had like a pretty good season where he seemed to be kind of clicking, and then more recently he just had almost like a downfall. Like it's almost like we've completely regressed. We're going backwards, and a lot of people are they're really confused by this, right? Because it's like, and I was really confused by this. But keep in mind, I'm not somebody who's a quarterback evaluator, right? Like, my interest in college football is somewhat surface level and casual. I mean, I do try and understand what's going on, but I'm not as well versed in college football as like I am in the games that I play or something like that. You know what I mean? So I was actually a little bit perplexed by I was perplexed even with the slow start, because the way they were talking about him coming out of the draft was that he was so good that it almost didn't seem like it would matter what coach you put him with. But you do have to be a little bit careful with that thinking, because football is a very complex game. There's a lot of moving parts in the field. There's a lot of intentional practice that has to happen in the actual practices to prepare the players for the game. I do know that much. So, you can really have a coach completely mess things up, right? So I did give him the first season along with everybody else. I was a little surprised, but I was like, okay, I can understand what they're saying about the first season. But then when he got more of a support system, and he still wasn't really churning out the numbers, it was a little bit surprising for me. And even the season where he kind of like peaked, he had actually a really, he had a game that was very similar of the Patriots versus the Falcons. It was like that big of a deficit that he actually came back from. I think it's like his third year or something like that. That season was basically like his peak season. And even in that season, in my opinion, he didn't really look like the level of player that we saw in college. Now, obviously, you're not expecting him to necessarily put up the numbers he put up in college, in the sense that the NFL is going to be harder. But even in terms of like how that would how you would expect it to translate, it didn't seem to be translating as much for me. And I think that in a lot of ways, people latched on to that peak season from him because the other seasons were so bad, right? So in other words, like, if there was another quarterback that had the same type of season he had in his third season where he had the good season, maybe not quite as big of a deal would have been made out of it as with Trevor Lawrence, because everybody was so desperate for this guy to kind of like become good, right? They wanted him to step into that role, that heir apparent, and really kind of like fulfill the prophecy that people had been prophesizing about him since freshman year of high school, right? So the moment you even saw a glimpse at all of that, like, he seemed to be turning things around, people really hopped on that, and they really like took it all the way. So there was that, and then so I guess I was never really like fully sold that it was coming around. And then when the crash happened, though, I didn't expect the crash. And yeah, his play in the past, I think 1 or 2 years has been pretty abysmal. And it's just like shocking, because it's like, how could this player, who he looks the part, like he's tall, he's strong, he's got an arm on him, right? He fits all like the physical characteristics of what you think would be a good quarterback. He's relatively accurate from when he does like throw the ball in the right spot. He's relatively accurate, and for a long time it kind of evaded me as to like what was really going on with this kid. And then it was actually like a couple days ago I watched a video, and it kind of like elucidated me in terms of like what might actually be going on and what I missed about this person. Because like I said, I'm not like a a hardcore football analysis type person. So watching somebody else kind of do the analysis and explain it to me, I started to kind of pick up on what they were saying. And basically, I think that the video is something to the effect of Trevor Lawrence can't read NFL defenses. If you type that in, it'll probably come up. And there's a ton of videos about Trevor Lawrence covering the rise and the fall, but most of them talk about him like I'm talking about in this video, which I think is generally a bad thing for football videos. Because when I'm watching a football video, I'm expecting more analysis on the player, right, from these football channels that are claiming to do analysis. Obviously, I'm a classic WoW player, so when I'm talking about him here, I can only speak about it in generalities. But yeah, I had watched so many videos before, kind of like talking about why he's not panning out, and it was all just like very general stuff, like very nebulous things. And this video kind of got specific, and it was talking about how he just doesn't seem to have developed the ability to read NFL defenses. But I guess kind of what that really means is his decision making in the game is poor on in a relative sense to his peers, right? So it's not that he obviously knows nothing about football. He's a professional football player, right? But compared with other quarterbacks and things of that nature, right? Other high level players, this person who did the video on him was mentioning that he just seems to be deficient, And I was watching the video, and again, I don't understand completely everything that's going on the football field, but the points he was making were kind of making sense to me, and it started to click into my head that that really is kind of probably the most important thing for a quarterback. And it actually made me think back to Tom Brady because, I come from the Northeast, and so Tom Brady's a huge thing here, especially when he was active. He was playing for the Patriots, right? Everybody was a Patriots fan, and again, I was never the deepest person into football, but I always kind of admired just how prepared he was, his mentality, everything like that as a competitor, right? So I used to watch whenever he played, basically, usually, especially in the big games, like the playoff games, the Super Bowl. And one thing that I was thinking about after watching the video is just how you very rarely see Tom Brady make huge mistakes. You don't see a lot of interceptions out of Tom Brady, and when you do see interceptions, it was very, very high pressure, right? And again, I'm no football expert, but I can tell when they're really going after the quarterback, when there's the game plan is basically mess the guy up. So you saw barely any mistakes, right? And the other thing with Brady that I'd noticed, even as kind of a casual fan, is he would just get the ball out so quick, and there was no worry about oh, we're gonna hit this guy away downfield, or it was literally just about get yards on the board to kind of get to the next line. Because if you don't really know how football works, it's basically played 10 yards at a time, and they have 4 plays basically to get 10 yards, and if they don't, they have to turn the ball over to the enemy team. Usually this stops short at the 3rd down, where if you don't get the 3rd down and the 4th down, you're kicking the ball away so that you don't give the opposing team more field position, right? So you'll have some quarterbacks where they'll really try and force the ball downfield, get big gains, and Brady was never really the quarterback to do that. He had the capability to do it, but he would just kind of eat people up by throwing shorter passes, getting really more consistent yards, and he wouldn't really turn the ball over, didn't get strip sacked normally, and when he would turn the ball over, it'd be a big deal, right? And you could tell the announcement would be a shock, it's wow, Tom Brady. It reminds me of the Super Bowl against the Falcons, when they were already playing kind of poorly in that Super Bowl. They didn't really have a good Super Bowl in the first half, and then he throws the pick six. And that was just people couldn't believe that he threw a pick six in that situation. It's Tom Brady's supposed to be Mr. Clutch, the guy who is always super prepared. And then he goes and throws a pick six. Of course, they end up coming back and winning that game. But you kind of get the point, right? He didn't make many mistakes and didn't have many mental lapses. And when you compare that to Trevor Lawrence's play, it's not super fair in a way, because obviously Lawrence is a much younger player. But even when Brady was younger, when he won the 3 Super Bowls earlier in his career, a big part of that, in my opinion, was not necessarily that he was playing phenomenal in all those games, but that he wasn't, in terms of his athletic ability, right? In some ways he was playing phenomenal, I think, in terms of his decision making, right? But we're talking about, it's not like he was, just slinging the ball down the field, throwing 70, 60-yard long balls or 30-yard touchdown passes or anything like that. So he basically just, he was the same kind of player back then than he was later in his career. It's just he got better, obviously, right? He learned more, but the same core decision making, it seems like he had a really good fundamental understanding of the game, even early on, right? And with Lawrence, it just doesn't seem to be the case. He doesn't seem to understand some of the subtleties when reading the defense, or he'll read the defense properly from before the snap happens, but then he can't seem to adjust post-snap, which is something that Brady seemed to really excel at. You know what I mean? And this video really kind of brought that to light for me. And all of a sudden, it kind of made sense because I was like, it really just doesn't matter how good you are in any other aspect. Does it really matter how tight your spiral is? Does it really matter how well you throw the football generally, how far you can throw it? Does it matter how fast you are on your feet? Does it matter how well you can scramble in the pocket? Outside the pocket? Does it matter how poised you are inside the pocket if you actually don't make good decisions when it comes to where you're throwing the football? Because it's almost like we kind of get ahead of ourselves with all these stats, right? Oh, he's 6'5". He can throw the ball effortlessly this far. He can run the 40 at this speed in the combine, right? He looks the part. The phone, of course, goes off. He's confident. He's this, he's that. And in reality, it's like, does he put the ball where it needs to go? And obviously that's an oversimplification. But if you were to ask that question, what you'd basically be asking is, does he have the prerequisite knowledge to understand in these various situations where to put the ball more times than not? In 8 out of 10 times, is he going to make the right decision here? And that's really the most important thing, right, is decision making. And it got me thinking, kind of like almost the converse of him, of Trevor Lawrence, when I'm looking into the esports realm. And it's this player called Peterbot, and that's actually the name that my paladin is kind of named after, because I was joking with my friend. We were watching Fortnite FNCS when I actually made the character, and I was like, if he wins this tournament, I'm just gonna name my paladin that I've been planning on making Peterbot, just like tribute to the GOAT, because this is a crazy performance. And he ended up winning, and I made the character. But yeah, so what I'm saying is I'm kind of comparing Trevor Lawrence to Peterbot now, which seems weird. Like, why are we comparing a football player to an esports player that plays Fortnite, right? Like, what could possibly what could possibly be the point of this comparison? But it's obviously not about any of the individual skills as they're different for their relative sport, but it's about the fact that Peterbot's game sense, if you will, or decision making, in my opinion, is what actually separates him from a bunch of the other players, right? And I think there's a lot of misconceptions that happen with him, because he, kind of like Trevor Lawrence, is actually really good in a lot of the other categories, right? So his mechanics, in terms of building in that game, very, very top tier, right? In terms of his aim, also top tier. But the interesting thing with Peterbot is that if you were to really watch, I was watching, I got really into the Fortnite scene. I was actually watching scrims, and I would even watch sometimes they would play creative after the scrim sessions, and you'd play these other top players, and there's this mode where you basically just build, you're building and you're shooting, and you're trying to basically kill the other person, right? And it's to a certain score. And you'd watch him in these creative matches, and he's phenomenal. But against the very top players in the game, right? The very top 1v1 type players, he doesn't seem unbeatable, and there would even be scenarios where he would lose. There's this Brazilian player that's really good called King, and this person I've seen beat him in creative. There's a person from Japan, I believe, called Coyote, and he's a very, very mechanical player. And when Peterbot went to a LAN, the Pro-Am, they did one of these creative sessions when they were practicing, warming up for the tournament, and he beat Peterbot in that. Now, granted, you can take all these with a grain of salt, right? Because it's not like they're playing best out of 20 matches, I guess, right? And he's also not playing in his normal setup. Barely had time to set up in these things. Obviously, you could say the same for his opponent, but sometimes these differences affect one player more than the other for various reasons, right? So if you give a player enough time to set up, they will be really dominant, right? And there's other players that can be dominant with maybe less than ideal of setup. But my whole point is that even if you played the match with him and Coyote or him and King out of 20 times, and Peterbot wins like 15 out of 5. So maybe it was a fluke that he lost like those one-offs, right? And against some other players. Another player called Zen that he plays against that is, I think usually that guy's considered like the king of creative. And he beat Peterbot. And, even if he's losing like the one-off against these guys, so if he played him out of 20 times, he'd win him 15 out of 20. The whole point is he's still very beatable, it seems like, in this particular format, right? Like, it's not like a scrub can't beat him, like a lower tier player can't really beat him. But in terms of the high tier players, like the tier 1 players, the ones that are really playing for the championships in that game, they're called FNCSs, they can beat him. But the weird part is that he has like way more wins than all these other players, right? And it's not about his team, really. He does have generally always a good team. He has strong players on his team, but he is usually, like, I would say actually in all cases, the best player on his team in pretty much every championship that he's won, in every FNCS. So it's not as if he's getting carried in these wins. And you can basically see it from the eye test in the game in terms of certain stats like damage ratio or damage done with a shotgun, right? He usually like leads these categories. Eliminations. You can also just watch him playing in the game, watching how he plays compared to other players, right? How much pressure he applies. So it's not like he's getting carried to these wins, right? Because you'll have cases like that, like in basketball. Not saying that I don't want to use the term get carried for Bill Russell, but there's always that argument, well, if you're going to measure things in championships, why isn't Bill Russell the GOAT, right? And it's like, well, intuitively we understand why Bill Russell isn't really in the GOAT contention category, because he wasn't the primary factor on all those wins that he had, right? Like you would say Michael Jordan would be when you compare him to Jordan, right? And that's kind of like the same thing with Peterbot. Is like he is the driving factor for a lot of these FNCS wins. In fact, in some of the FNCS wins, he's had like insane solo clutches where it's like literally been him kind of taking over the game. So it's pretty much clear that he is the like really, really strong player in this scene, right? And he's not getting carried. So if that's the case, though, right, then why are these other players who are beating him in creative mode or whatever, right, and can beat him in like one-off, kind of like one-off cases, why aren't they beating him in the actual like legitimate game, right? And I think the answer is just really obvious, and it's his decision making is like on another level and unparalleled and insane compared to these other players. So when they're getting him one-on-one in creative, this is his very weakest. It's almost like if you're watching an anime, right, and like Goku is in base form or something, and he's fighting somebody. And so it's almost like if you're watching Peterbot do creative versus somebody like Zen or somebody like King or something like that, he's in base form against these people while they're in like Super Saiyan or whatever their form is, right? He hasn't even left his normal form yet, because his power-up is really his like decision-making and how he understands the game and how he not only understands it on a macro level, but understands and how it navigates specific fights. Like he's really, really, really strong at fighting in a tournament setting, right, where you actually have limited mats and you can't just build everywhere and everything like that. Because the creative mode is a little different. I think you have like infinite builds, so you can play kind of weird and creative if you want, right? You can play very like baity, whereas in the normal game you have limited numbers of builds. You have zone coming in on you, right? So there's a lot more factors that go into your decision making, and you have to kind of pre-plan and really understand where you're going to be in the next maybe 2 to 3 minutes of the game, right? Where you want to be and what that entails for you, like how you can set up and get kills in a certain area. And Peterbot, in my opinion, is just so far ahead of all the other players in this particular aspect that it's really no wonder why he wins, right? It's like, it's not even a question. It has nothing to do with really his mechanics. It has nothing to do with his aim. It's really his decision making. Now, you obviously can't have the worst aim in the world or the worst mechanics in the world and also put on this type of performance, right? But you just need to be on the higher end of those things. And like once you get to a certain threshold, it's all basically decision making, in my opinion. Like, decision making will bail you out for being the weaker mechanical player in tons of scenarios. It'll bail you out for not having the best aim in tons of scenarios, and it just kind of like all came together. And yeah, I just, so I think in some ways it's like I always knew it, but I think decision making is just the most important thing in almost any competitive activity that's not like obviously something like running. I used to do running, and there's not as much decision making in running, right? A lot of it just does kind of come down to your physical ability. There are some cases of like how you manage your race. I don't want to like completely say that there's no brain that goes into running, but obviously the amount of like strategy in a running race versus the amount of strategy in a Fortnite tournament in terms of macro and micro level strategy is just not even close, right? So there are some exceptions, obviously, but I think especially in the realm of video games, which is, most of the people watching this are probably going to be, from, decision making is the most important thing. So if you want to get good at any particular game, you just want, the best thing you can do is try and break it down and try and figure out like how the game works, and really figure out the most core concepts to winning, because and obviously you want to train your mechanics, you want to train your aim in games that use these things, but realistically, as long as those are at a like a suitable place where you're not losing the game outright based on those being too weak a part of your game, the most important thing is decision making by far, and I think that's only gonna get more important as they release more and more games where they tighten the mechanical skill gap. So yeah, just get good at decision making. Obviously a lot easier said than done, but I think it is kind of a good point to mention, because I still think a lot of people are dead set on like the brute force mechanicking your way to being the best. That seems to be like because it's the most obvious path, like I said in the start of the video, and it makes sense. But I really do think if you really want to be the best at something, trying to understand it completely is by far way better than trying to brute force any one particular aspect. And honestly, this is a reason why I really like healing Classic WoW, right? And I'm not trying to say that Classic WoW, don't get me wrong when I start this next part, I'm not trying to say that this is like a super skill expressive game, but somebody commented on one of my videos like a week back when I made the video about your healing power not mattering, and it's about how you play. It's more important, and they were just laughing like as if you could even possibly express any type of skill in Classic WoW. And I get what they mean from a certain perspective, because the game's not very mechanical, which is again what we talked about. It's how normally people view games, right, in terms of being hard or not. And but the reality is the thing I like about the healing role in this game is it is very decision-making heavy, right? Because you have a lot of players that potentially can be taking damage, and there's like a lot of room for you to try and like accurately predict, and it's not just guessing randomly, right? And kind of deciding like which player, it's like the triage, right? Of like which players you need to heal right at that moment to keep them alive, and which players can go a little bit without getting healed, and then switching between those. And it's very simple on face, right? Like there's not a lot going on. There's not a ton of keybinds in this game. There's not a ton of like mechanical skill. Your APM is very capped, obviously, because of things like the GCD and everything like that. But there is, still a lot of area where you can show yourself to be more proficient than another player in terms of the decision-making process of like how you approach a specific fight, but more importantly, really who you're going to heal on that fight, and based on who takes damage. I guess like not preemptively, but like reactively. Like your decision making when things kind of hit the fan and they go bad. And that's one of the funnest parts about being a healer. I think that's why it kind of attracts me to healing Classic WoW, because obviously in this version of the game, you don't have a lot of opportunities to make more macro-oriented orientated decisions, like maybe you would in retail World of Warcraft, right? So for example, when they're doing Race for the World First, you'll have people that, like I think THD in the bug instance that was like 2 tiers ago or a tier ago, where he basically saved the raid by gating someplace and picking up one of the orbs, right? And that's kind of what I'm talking about. That's like the Peterbot effect, right? Like that's the type of thing that you can't teach, and you just have to have like an intuitive understanding. You have to have very good situational awareness, and you don't really have as many of those moments in classic WoW because the game's not just designed that way, as like especially as like DPS. So healing is kind of the role where you simulate the most of those moments, right? Because when things get chaotic, your decision making there becomes kind of like the most important thing in the raid, which is really cool. So yeah, that's basically why I like healing in WoW, and I think decision making is pretty much the most important thing. So whatever game you're playing, whether it be WoW, Fortnite, any new competitive game, League of Legends, just definitely try and get good at understanding, and always think about why you're doing things, and if doing things another way could potentially produce a better result. And I think if you just have that mentality, you're going to go a lot further than only practicing your mechanics and only trying to break your like mechanical limits, if that makes sense. So, yep, just another ranty video, but hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you guys for watching, and I will talk to you next time. See ya.